Thank you all for joining us today for the third plenary session of the 2020 Catholic Immigrant Integration Initiative Conference, which is titled From Emigration to Immigration, Ireland's Attempt to Build Communities of Belonging. My name is Catherine Wilsden and I am the Programme Manager and Liaison for Notre Dame's Kyonokton Institute for Irish Studies based here in Dublin. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to thank the conference organisers, Father Bob Dowd and Daniela Alulema, for inviting the Institute to contribute to the conference. I think it's appropriate that a university with such a strong link historically to the emigration from Ireland to the US convenes this discussion. The Kyonokton Institute for Irish Studies is dedicated to the study of Irish culture in Ireland and around the world in all of its manifestations. I'd like to thank the Institute's Assistant Director, Mary Hendrickson, as well as Professor Gary Murphy at Dublin's City University and Teresa Hanlon at the Kellogg Institute for their help in putting this session together. We are joined today by Minister Roderick O'Gorman. Dr. O'Gorman is Minister for Children, Disability, Equality, Integration and Youth. He is a member of the Green Party and represents the Dublin West constituency. Prior to his ministerial appointment, Dr. O'Gorman was chair of the Green Party. He also served as a member of the Fingal County Council in North Dublin and worked as a law lecturer at Dublin City University, specialising in EU and planning law. Welcome, Minister. Thank you for joining us. I'd like to invite you now to give your remarks titled From Emigration to Immigration Country, Ireland's Attempt to Build Communities of Belonging.
That's great, Catherine. Can you just give me a thumbs up that you can hear me all right there? Brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you for that very kind introduction. And I'd like to start by thanking the Centre for Migration Studies and the Catholic Immigrant Integration Initiative for inviting me to speak here today. As Catherine said, it's evening here in Dublin, but good afternoon to you all online. I suppose it's a shame we can't be gathered in person. I hear the Irish are always afforded a very warm welcome in South Bend, and I know that Notre Dame has always treasured its close relationship with Ireland. Nonetheless, I think at times like these, when we are all kind of having to separate ourselves, I think it's really good to come together in that spirit of solidarity, even if virtually, and I think it's all the more important in the very difficult and distanced world we're all living in at the moment. And look, it's really heartening to see the scale of the work being done by all the speakers and the attendees at this particular conference. While Ireland has what I think you could fairly describe as a difficult relationship with the Catholic Church, at the same time, many of the more radical social justice organisations in Ireland working in areas like homelessness, migration, or indeed tackling addiction, they have their roots in religious orders like the Franciscans, the Capuchins, or the Jesuits. And indeed, like many Irish people, I can list various aunts, uncles, and great uncles who've taken vows within the Catholic Church. So just maybe to introduce myself initially and give a little bit of background, I was first elected to the Dáil, which is the Irish National Parliament, in February of this year. And following involvement in programme for government negotiations in June of this year, I was appointed as Minister for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth. And I suppose Minister is probably the equivalent somewhat of a Secretary of State within the US system. So quite a dramatic change in my life over the last couple of months. This time last year, I would have been preparing to start into the new academic term, giving lectures in DCU. So it's quite a big change. And I think you can probably gather from the title of my department, it's a very wide remit. It's a new role. Previously, it had just been the Minister for Children and Youth Affairs, but we've expanded it quite significantly. In Ireland, we had our general election in February of this year, and it was just before the full extent of the COVID-19 pandemic had become clear. And this means that the post-election landscape was very different to the landscape in which people were initially casting their ballots. I'm a member of the Green Party, and our founding principles are rooted in social justice and in environmental justice. And these principles, and particularly the principle of social justice, they don't cease to become relevant because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Indeed, they become more urgent, more applicable. And because what we've seen in Ireland, and I think probably around much of the world, is that the impact of the pandemic has been exacerbated or compounded by existing inequalities that exist in most countries. And what I and my colleagues in the Green Party were hoping to do in creating the Department for Children, Equality, Disability, Integration and Youth were to bring together people who for one reason or other are marginalized or vulnerable, whether they be migrants, ethnic minorities, people with disabilities, LGBTI+, or young people. Each of the groups that come within the remit of my department have been excluded, sometimes deliberately, from politics and from the political process. And we want to bring their voice to the decisions being made by the Irish government. And I think our department also recognizes the multiple and complex identities that every individual has. And those multiple identities can often also mean multiple vulnerabilities and combined vulnerabilities. So I've been asked to speak today about Ireland's attempts to build communities of belonging. The Ireland of today is far more diverse, more multicultural than it's ever been in the past. And the idea of who belongs in Ireland has widened rapidly in recent years. We've gone from a country that was almost entirely Catholic, overwhelmingly white, a country known from sending its young people around the world in search of work, to being a far more vibrant, a more multicultural place. But that change isn't without its challenges. And some of those challenges are unique to Ireland, and some of those challenges we see in other countries all over the world. And they include the use of social media to peddle myths and to promote hate, the rise of the far right, and increased migration as a result of climate change. And the challenge for me as a minister in the Irish government is how do we confront those challenges and confront them in a compassionate but also in a practical way. And the invite for this speech arrives shortly after I'd just been appointed. And since the invitation was extended, it's something I've had the chance to reflect on, that idea of a community and of belonging. And a number of weeks ago, I visited a community centre in Dublin's north inner city, which is traditionally a very socially deprived part of Dublin. But it's also an area that's seen a lot of migrant communities developing and setting up in the last number of years. And this community centre prides itself on its inclusivity. And on the walls outside the building are images of the children that attend the centre from multiple and diverse backgrounds. And the woman, her name is Eileen, who runs the centre, she told me that the reason for these pictures is that it's only when the children see themselves represented and included as the part of the community that they actually really themselves feel that they belong there. I thought it was a really nice, it was a very striking image, but the thinking behind it really appealed to me. And equally, for people from migrant backgrounds who attended the community centre, they told me that by being involved in that community centre, it had actually helped them feel part of the local community. They get to know their neighbours, they make friends. One woman who was originally from China told me how this year she celebrated Chinese New Year on the street in the centre of Dublin with the entire community, many of them born and bred Dubs, many of them originally from all over the world. And traditions that originated elsewhere are now becoming shared traditions in a way that brings a community together. Maybe just to fully establish the challenges and opportunities that we have within Ireland's reach when it comes to migration, it might be worthwhile to speak a little bit about where we've come from, what kind of country Ireland was for a very long time, and then look at the recent trends we've seen in respect of migration. And in many ways, a speech about Ireland's past is almost an easier one than a speech about our present, because I think Ireland's historical story is so well known to most people. So look, I'll keep that element short, but just I suppose to recall, for decades, Ireland and Irishness were defined in very narrow terms. The country, particularly in the decades after independence from Britain, committed itself to a small-minded conservative Catholicism. It wasn't a very diverse place. In the 1961 census, 95% of the population were Catholic, 4.5% of the population were other Christian denominations, and only 0.3% were marked as other religions. And indeed, in terms of where people were born, your options on the census were quite limited. They were Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales, the United States of America, or other countries. And only about 11,500 people ticked the box for other countries. And in total, only about 0.6% of the population, of the total population, had been born outside of either Ireland or the United Kingdom. And the census shows that around that time, only about 1,500 people were migrating into Ireland each year. So that was, I suppose, the context as regards the movement of people and people's origins. But I think it's also maybe good to talk slightly about the social context as well. And in that context, institutionalization was the common answer for social issues. So you had unmarried mothers with children, children from disadvantaged backgrounds, people with mental health issues. They all faced institutionalization, often in really brutal conditions. And people left Ireland. And those of you in the US, you know this as well as anybody else. People left Ireland because of the poor economic situation in the country. They left because of the violence in the north of the country. And they left because of a hostility to anyone who was perceived as different or deviated from that very narrow view of Irishness that I described. And as countries all over Western Europe were experiencing waves of immigration throughout the 20th century, not just Britain or indeed the US, but other countries in Western Europe, Ireland was an outlier. We were continuously a net exporter of people. And that stretched up even until the mid-1980s. In 1987, again, when the country was undergoing a severe recession, around only about 17,000 people were immigrating into the country at that time, out of a population of 3.5 million. But in the last 30 years, that's changed hugely. And two factors have shifted the historical trends of migration in Ireland. First of all, a booming economy since the 1990s, and secondly, the accession of Eastern European countries to the European Union in 2004. So since gaining independence in the 20s, our country's economy always struggled, and the 1980s, as I described earlier on, was a particularly difficult time. But that changed in the 1990s with the so-called Celtic Tiger. Our economy began to grow very rapidly. It was initially fueled by a lot of foreign direct investment from the IT sector and the pharmaceutical sector, and that later combined with a very significant property bubble. And while immigration did increase slowly during the 1990s, it was the 2004 accession of Eastern European countries to the European Union that brought about a significant change in inward migration. And in 2004, 10 Central and Eastern European countries joined the European Union. And Ireland was one of the few of the existing 15 EU member states that didn't place any barriers or restrictions on the movement of people from the new accession countries to Ireland. And as such, between 2004 and 2007, over 300,000 people migrated to Ireland. And for a country that had a population then of 4 million and no real history of immigration, this was a very significant change. And yes, there was a brief dip in inward migration in around 2008 to 2010 during the global recession. But since 2015, Ireland again has net immigration. And in 2018, Ireland had one of the fourth highest foreign-born population in the European Union. If we look at the largest non-Irish nationalities in Ireland, the largest populations are again from countries in Central and Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, Romania, but it all should be noted there's a significant Brazilian population and a significant Indian population as well. And it's worth reflecting on that role that the EU plays in Ireland, because opinion polls show that 83% of Irish people believe that our membership of the European Union is a good thing. That's the third highest in the European Union of all the member states, and only 3% say that our membership of the EU is a bad thing. And obviously this shows a very significant divergence from our nearest neighbour in the United Kingdom, who are still trying to extricate themselves from the EU 4 years after having voted to leave the European Union. And Euroscepticism and linked xenophobia, it's never emerged in Ireland as the way it did in the UK. For people in Ireland, our membership, our participation in the European Union has always been a way for us as a very small country to reach out into the wider world. At the same time as increasing diversity in terms of nationality, we've also experienced a broader and very rapid social liberalisation over the last 30 years. And we put it in the context of up until 1994, homosexuality was a criminal offence, and up until 1995, divorce was illegal in this country. And then you fast forward to 3 decades, and in 2015, Ireland voted to allow same-sex marriage, and in 2018, to end the constitutional ban on abortion. And until just 3 months ago, the Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, was Leo Varadkar, who is gay and is the son of an Indian-born father. And I know that fact gained a lot of attention, maybe internationally when he was first elected, but it's not. Neither fact are something that's hugely remarked upon in Ireland. So given the current levels of migration into Ireland, I'd like to look at 2 issues. Firstly, how migrants are faring in Ireland, and secondly, the attitudes of Irish people towards migrants. And look, in doing so, I'm indebted to a recent report from the Economic and Social Research Institute based here in Dublin, which is going to provide a lot of the details. And that report, Origin and Integration, a study of migrants in the 2016 Irish census, gives really invaluable data on integration in this country. So the report looked at 4 indicators of skills and labour market outcomes, comparing migrants respondents born in Ireland, and these are English language ability, educational attainment, unemployment, and occupational attainment. What the report found is that most migrant groups report higher educational attainment than the Irish-born population, but there are significant variations within the different groups. There's a wide variation in employment based on migrant group, with people from an African background faring particularly badly. As the report itself states, there are significant differences in the labour market outcomes between migrants from different ethnic groups. These remain even when we control for the migrant's country of birth, their level of education, their language ability, and their gender and age. We suggest this difference may stem from ethnic discrimination, and that measures to combat this discrimination would have important implications for migrant integration. If we look at where migrants in Ireland tend to work among recent immigrants, the major sections are accommodation and food service, information and communication, and wholesale and retail. And even within these sectors, we see big differences between migrant groups. For example, there are a large number of Polish people working in the construction sector, whereas accommodation and food services have a significant proportion of people from outside of Europe. In terms of where migrants live, research has found that migrant populations are highly centralised in urban areas, in particular the city centres of Dublin, Limerick and Cork, and the suburbs of West and North Dublin. And my own constituency, the area I'm elected from, is West Dublin, which has a very high migrant population. We're a very diverse area. However, there is evidence of a small decrease in the concentration of migrants from the EU over the last 10 years. However, research has also found that migrants with poor English language skills tend to live in more disadvantaged areas. So, having given a sense of where the migrants in Ireland, how migrants in Ireland are faring, I suppose it's good to look at how Ireland is responding to migration. And as I said before, we didn't experience similar waves of migration that other European countries did. immigration to Ireland is a very recent phenomenon, and this poses a number of questions. First of all, to what extent Irish people, having been forced to move abroad for work and facing discrimination ourselves, has that increased our levels of sympathy or empathy indeed with those coming to Ireland? And secondly, what lessons has Ireland learned from how other countries have responded to immigration at a policy level? And I think these two questions drive at the heart of the idea of a community of belonging, because the opportunities of integration and belonging to some extent only exist insofar as they are extended by the population within a country and within the wider apparatus of the state. So to the first question, in my own view, this has been helped to some degree to keep a lid on anti-immigration sentiment that we see in other countries. The fact that so many people in Ireland have gone abroad, and we know certainly from our country's history that many Irish people faced very severe discrimination in the countries they moved to. So in Ireland, discussion of migration within our mainstream media is, broadly speaking, very responsible. There's no far-right party that has representation in our parliament. There have been attempts to establish far-right parties, but in general, they've met with very little success, even during the very difficult recession that our country faced in the early part of this decade, at a time when we saw far-right parties do extremely well in other European states. And people in Ireland, because of our country's history, we do have a strong sense of international solidarity. And often if we talk about migrants risking their lives across the Mediterranean, maybe from North Africa, in the hope of reaching a better life in Ireland, the point has been made and is made that not too long ago, Irish people were doing the same, crossing the Atlantic, again in very difficult conditions, to try and establish a better life in the United States. So outwardly, at least, Ireland seems to have been broadly successful in integrating new arrivals. But of course, what people say and what they really think can often be two very different things. Another report that was produced by the ESRI and the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission looked at Irish people's hidden attitudes towards minorities. And the research used a list experiment approach, which compares anonymously expressed attitudes to those expressed more openly, to seek to understand the extent to which people were concealing controversial opinions when polled. And whereas 66% of people openly supported more Black people coming to Ireland, this dropped to 51% when respondents could conceal their attitude. Fewer people openly supported more Muslim immigration, with no evidence that people conceal their attitudes. And while previous studies have shown that people with higher educational attainment are more positive towards minorities in Ireland and elsewhere, this research reveals that this is largely because highly educated people who hold negative attitudes are more likely to conceal them. So among people with third level education, over 1/4 do not support more Black people coming into Ireland, but conceal that view, and just under 1/5 conceal negativity towards more Muslims coming to Ireland. Concealed negative view is almost twice as prevalent among younger groups as among older groups with respect to the question on Black immigration. Though it is worth noting that younger groups are far more supportive than older groups when they are asked anonymously about that. I mentioned earlier that Ireland does not have a far-right party represented in the Irish Parliament, and it doesn't mean, however, that we don't have a far-right within the country. And we have seen, particularly since the coronavirus restrictions were put in place in Ireland, an attempt by the far-right to adopt or co-opt certain issues in order to expand their influence. They've marched against masks, they've marched against the broader public health measures, and even I, as a gay man who happens to be the Minister for Children, I was the subject to a march against my ministry as well. And throughout all of this, they're looking to recruit people in the hope of pushing their xenophobic and racist ideology. And alongside this, they obviously, like they do in every other country, use social media to distort reality for their own ends. An electrical fire which burned down a house in the Dublin suburbs was portrayed without absolutely any basis as the result of a gang war between migrant groups. However, there are substantive conversations happening in this country as well. Like so many countries around the world, the Black Lives Matter movement, which started in the United States, sparked a discussion here around race and migration. And those conversations have challenged Ireland in how it sees itself. We pride ourselves on being on our welcome, on our friendliness, on our historical solidarity with oppressed groups. We view ourselves as very much part of that community of belonging. But when the killing of George Floyd happened and minority voices began to be heard more, we found that as a country, we had more work to do, further to go on race than we actually realized. And as Minister for the issues of integration and equality, this is something I'm very conscious of. And this brings us to the second question I raised. What have we learned from other countries? How is the Irish governmental policy looking to create those communities of belonging? Following the election in February, my Green Party colleagues and I negotiated a programme for government with our two coalition partners in government. And this agreement between the three parties sets out what we hope to achieve in our term of office. And throughout those negotiations, we were conscious of the need for the Irish government to respond in a substantive and meaningful terms to the challenge of communities of belonging. And in that agreement, we are looking to create a new national integration strategy and a new national anti-racism strategy. We haven't had an anti-racism strategy in Ireland since 2008, which is extremely problematic considering the diversity, the growth and the diversity of our country's population in that time. And that's something that I'm looking forward to leading on. But discussing current government commitments also brings me to the highest profile and perhaps most contentious issue when it comes to migration in Ireland, and that's a system called direct provision. And if you walk the streets in Dublin on signposts and in windows, you'll see stickers saying end direct provision. And if you attend a protest held by any left-wing group in this country, you're likely to see signs saying end direct provision. And if you pick up any newspaper on every day, you'll see articles about the problems with direct provision and calling for it to be ended. So much of the broader conversation about immigration in Ireland and how Ireland treats people who come here is now centred on the issue of direct provision. So to give a little bit of background, direct provision was introduced in 1999 as an emergency measure in order to house refugees, so people coming to Ireland seeking asylum status. And direct provision is created to house them while their asylum application is being processed. People in direct provision, they're provided with accommodation and with food by the state, and they're also provided with a small weekly stipend. And 20 years on from its creation as a short-term solution, direct provision still exists, and it is the subject of significant and widespread criticism from human rights groups. And one of the most significant issues with direct provision is the length of time people are staying in this system while they're waiting for their international protection application to be adjudicated on. And that process can take years. And until recently, people living in direct provision weren't allowed work while they were waiting for their application to be assessed. And they face multiple barriers accessing bank accounts or driver's licenses, and many of the other day-to-day minutiae that sometimes, helps you feel like part of a community. And adding to these problems are the accommodation provided. Such accommodation is often in remote areas. Sometimes it's little more than mobile homes. And in many settings, you have situations where you have people who are complete strangers sharing bedrooms, sharing dorm rooms for long periods of time. And the vast majority of the people in direct provision are fleeing hardship. And some of them are fleeing particularly, or have undertaken particularly grueling journeys to get to Ireland. They've undergone mental trauma. Some of them have undergone sexual assault. And for people who are particularly vulnerable like that, direct provision is not a good setting. And since it was originally established as an emergency response, direct provision itself is not good at responding to emergency trends. So as the number of people seeking asylum in Ireland increased, particularly with the very significant wave of migration we saw in the mid part of this decade, the system of direct provision hasn't been able to respond. So the state has had to accommodate people in emergency accommodation, hotels. So you have families living in hotels for years at a time. Right now, there's about 7,700 people living in direct provision. And due to the serious housing shortages in general in the country and significant homelessness crisis that we're experiencing in the country, a proportion of that 7,700 have already received refugee status, but they're not able to move out of direct provision because there's nowhere for them to move to. And I spoke about Ireland's history of institutionalization earlier on, and particularly about the institutionalization of people who the state back in the 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s viewed as problematic. And for many, direct provision today is reminiscent of that approach to how we treat vulnerable people. So as part of the programme for government agreed earlier this year, the Green Party secured a commitment to end direct provision over the lifetime of this government and replace it with a system that focuses on the provision of own door, not-for-profit accommodation. And for me, this is at the core of a community of belonging. For people, particularly those who come here looking for help, to be valued, to be visible, and to be respected. Someone will not feel that they belong if they're put in a mobile home park a few miles outside of a town. And ending direct provision will be one of the biggest challenges faced by my department, but we will have a system that respects the basic dignity of the people who seek asylum here. And I believe this is our chance to learn from other countries. We can see what has been done around the world, particularly in Western Europe, and approach this in a considered way, ensuring we avoid the mistakes that others have made. So just to offer a few concluding thoughts, the reality is that Ireland creating that community of belonging is still a work in progress. And I think what the rise of the far right around the world has demonstrated is that no country is immune to anti-migrant sentiment. And the creation of a community of welcome in a country that welcomes, accepts, and supports migrants is an ongoing piece of work. And there's no moment where we can ever consider that that job is done. Acceptance and empathy, they're active verbs. They are conscious choices that we must make, both individually and collectively, in how we approach the world. And that applies both to those who move to this country, but also those with fears about people moving here. They see stories on social media, or they hear something from their neighbour and they become concerned. And I spoke earlier about direct provision in Ireland. And when new direct provision centres have been opened in some parts of the country, there have been difficulties. There have been protests against the arrival of direct provision and the people living there. And indeed, in 2 instances, the proposed accommodation have actually been burnt out. And part of this is the far right exploiting people's fears. But where a community has been engaged with in a genuine and substantive way, and genuine fears that they may have are engaged with and addressed, what we see in communities across the country is real solidarity, a great sense of welcome. And many direct provision centres have had a friendship group established around them. So Irish people living in the local community, undertaking activities in the direct provision centre, and also seeking to link the people living in those direct provision centres with community activities already taking place. When we make the conscious choice to be more open, empathetic, and accepting, we see what could be divisive becoming a force for good and a force for community. And I think back to the Family Resource Centre in Dublin I mentioned at the beginning of this speech. And as I said, they celebrated Chinese New Year out in the street in the centre of Dublin in the heart of a working class community with all members of that community. And it was actually, as it happened, the last street party they had before the lockdown restrictions kicked in. And some of the parents who bring their kids to the community centre spoke about the support they provided to one another. Some of them were single parents, some of them were very new to this country. And they spoke about helping each other out with the practicalities of parenting, giving friendship during hard times, and how particularly that friendship and that sense of community was valued in the last 6 months, where many people were feeling isolated, were feeling alone. And when we talk about communities of belonging, when we talk about integration, this is exactly what we mean. This is exactly what we should be trying to achieve. It's not about assimilating, but it's not about segregation. When we bring the best of ourselves, our compassion, our understanding, and our traditions, we create stronger communities. And we have to be compassionate in our approach to migrants, because the government should reflect our country's very best intentions. And in a way, Ireland is still, very much at the start, very much beginning our journey when it comes to immigration, because it's through compassion that I believe we can and will create communities of belonging. And as I mentioned at the outset of this speech, one of the striking things from my visit to that community centre was the pictures on the wall. They were pictures of the children who used the centre, all from different backgrounds. The photos ran throughout the length of the wall, right through the building, except in one particular spot where they were interrupted by a sign made by the centre itself. And there were 2 words on that sign, and it said, "We belong." And I think that just encapsulates for me the vision of what we're trying to create. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that gave you some insight into what's happening in Ireland at the moment, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Minister, for those incredibly informative and insightful remarks. You've provided a really great overview, I think, for our audience of the significant social change that has occurred in Ireland in the past, say, 20 to 30 years. Thank you also for your candid remarks on your own recent experience of abuse from right-wing groups. It's a horrible thing to endure, and I'm really sorry that you had to go through that. I spend a lot of time working with Notre Dame students when they come to Ireland and during their semester abroad. And one of the things that they often remark upon is the absence of a distinct kind of right-wing ethno-nationalist kind of force in Ireland in comparison to other countries that either they're visiting or where they're coming from. And it's disappointing really to see these forces gain traction here in Ireland at the moment during the current crisis. And I think you're right in terms of there's kind of a vacuum at the moment, or I suppose it's because we're living our lives online that they're capitalizing on this time where we're forced to live online, and these things spread much faster there. I was struck by the findings you cited relating to the hidden attitudes to minorities. I hadn't come across that, and I just wanted to ask, how can communities kind of try to combat this phenomenon? It's really remarkable about the highly educated population who conceal their actual opinions, and especially kind of in our siloed or isolated existence during COVID-19, where we're not engaging in dialogue and discourse with our friends and network. Do you think perhaps like there are lessons to be learned from recent referenda in Ireland, where the individual stories of people contributed to change and resonated with the population, and can that aspect provide answers, do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good kind of analogy, and for those maybe who wouldn't have been closely following the 2 big social issue referendums in Ireland, the marriage equality referendum and repealing the 8th Amendment, the groups advocating a yes vote in both of those referendums focused on getting personal stories. So personal stories of gay men and women who were in a very long relationship but weren't able to have that recognized as a marriage, personal stories of their parents, often elderly parents, and talking about what the discrimination that their sons or daughters faced meant to them. And similarly, in the referendum on the repeal of the Eighth Amendment, personal stories of women who had traveled mainly to the United Kingdom for abortions in various circumstances, and how they felt the criminalization of abortion made them valued as members of society. And when you initially asked the question, Catherine, I suppose, how can we, or how can communities counteract that quiet prejudice there? And I think the best way is for those of us who don't have any prejudice to engage with our neighbours who are from different backgrounds, and through our engagement, I suppose, set examples, but also bring contexts where people who might have these silent attitudes can meet people from other backgrounds and see that their fears aren't realized. Because I think a lot of the people who have maybe a silent level of prejudice, people who, you know, on the far right, they're going to be loud on their prejudice. We're going to know their views. But I think the people who have that silent prejudice are people who maybe have the fears, and not justifiable, but just because the fear isn't justifiable doesn't mean that it should be written off. It should be addressed and explained. And I think that's important. So for those people who just, maybe elderly people who grew up in that very different Ireland and just find the difference of seeing people with a different skin color, or significant numbers of people with a different skin color in their town, there's just sometimes a traditional conservatism maybe, that they just want to withdraw or hold back from that. But if they meet people from migrant backgrounds through their church, or through their community group, or even someone who is, you know, doing the grocery checkout in their local shop, or is now teaching their children in the local school, or is the parent of their child's friend, that allows people to break down, I think, these silent, these fears that generate maybe that silent prejudice.
Yeah, so there's compassion and empathy due on that side as well, I suppose.
Yeah.
Can I ask you, before you became minister, you worked on a local level as an elected councillor for Fingal in Dublin. Can you tell us a little bit about your experience of integration in that constituency? You'd mentioned in your talk that you have a significant migrant population there, and maybe tell us about some significant or successful initiatives.
I think on the local level, there's a lot more to do as regards very focused initiatives. Where I saw integration happen best was in the context of schools, primary and secondary schools in the area, and I was on the board of management of a number of schools that would have had very diverse body of students coming to them. And because up to now the Irish state has not been as, and the Irish governments have not been as good as they should be as regards mainstreaming integration, a lot of the times the schools have to do this themselves, and some of them did amazing work. I was in one primary school which is for children from the ages of 5 to 11. So it's their first real school experience. And that school did incredible work in the terms of ensuring that every child was represented on the wall of each classroom, but their country of origin, or their parents' country of origin, was represented, their flag, a picture of the country, a fact about the country, maybe the favorite food, or an image that was very much associated with that country. And that degree of integration among the children flowed into the parents, and that flowed then out into the wider community. But I think it is fair to say that that was coming from the schools up, rather than necessarily coming from the government down. And I think, as I said, we're setting out a new national integration, migrant integration strategy that'll be led by my department. And I'm excited about it, that piece of work. I'm a bit daunted as well because we do have a lot of catching up to do. But I think we have the opportunity to look at best practice around Europe to see what has worked, see what hasn't worked as well, and build on the bottom-up initiatives like I saw in the schools in my area, like I saw more recently in the Family Resource Centre in the North Inner City, because there is really good practice happening in Ireland, but we need to do more to mainstream that across all parts of society.
I have a question here from one of our participants. Minister O'Gorman, how do you feel about that the 27th Amendment of the Irish Constitution contributes to anti-immigrant sentiment and hinders migration integration?
The 27th Amendment was brought in a number of years ago, and it changed the manner in which citizenship in Ireland was granted. And prior to that, the legal position in Ireland was if you were born on the island of Ireland, you automatically acquired Irish citizenship. And the Constitution was changed that year in light of very anecdotal and I think very overblown ideas that there was a significant number of people arriving in Ireland from other countries pregnant, having their child in Ireland, and therefore gaining Irish citizenship. And there was also a particular element about people being born in Northern Ireland and also being able to claim Irish citizenship following the Good Friday Agreement. So the Constitution was changed to allow the rules for Irish citizenship be set by legislation, and the legislation was subsequently changed to put some limitation on who could be born in Ireland and requiring some familial connection before citizenship was automatically granted. And it's an issue, and I think it's one we can look at in the context of legislation. I know in the years immediately following, it certainly caused issue for some families. I think in the context of the big challenges we face in terms of migration and in terms of integration and in terms of tackling racism, I suppose I would identify direct provision as one major challenge, and I would identify mainstreaming anti-racism across society as another big challenge and another big priority. And I would see my focus very much in those areas. When we were negotiating the programme for government, we didn't discuss the status of that particular constitutional amendment, and whereas not to negate its significance, my own view is that I suppose the political impetus from my department needs to be applied to ending direct provision and to ensuring we have a really strong anti-racism policy and a really strong migrant integration policy across the country.
And just to pick up on anti-racism policy, can you tell us just a bit more about how the Black Lives Matter movement, which obviously originated in the US following the death of George Floyd, has impacted communities in Ireland? And can you speak a little bit about, I think you have spoken previously about representation in sectors of society such as the An Garda Síochána. If you could just kind of speak to that a little bit, please.
Yeah, I think the Black Lives Matter impact has been very much in the context of young people in Ireland from different backgrounds. And I suppose we now have a whole generation of young people who were born here, whose parents were from other countries, but were born here, have gone to school here, see themselves very much as Irish, but are not seen as Irish by certain portions of society that we've spoken about already. And the context of, you know, racism that they've experienced is coming to the fore, and I suppose through social media that their experience now is becoming a lot more live, and I think it's something that all of us in Ireland need to engage with. I think you referenced the issue of the police, or our police are called An Garda Síochána over here, and we've an unarmed police force. They're seen very much as having a community safety role as opposed to necessarily a law enforcement role. But our Gardaí, our police, are not diverse. They do not reflect the, I suppose, ethnic or religious or any sort of the makeup of Ireland as it currently is. They reflect, I would say, very much that 1960s vision of Ireland. And that's something that needs to be addressed, because I think what we've seen from the real kind of cleavages that have grown between communities and the police in parts of the United States and in parts of the UK and France as well, is that when the police force doesn't look like, isn't seen to represent the community that it polices, trust will break down very quickly. And that's certainly something we have referred to again in our programme for governments, the need to improve the diversity within our national police force, and something that myself and the new Minister for Justice have been discussing.
Thank you. Can you speak a little bit about how the role of communities, you know, you're speaking about building or reforming the direct provision system and building a new system. What role do communities play in building a new system? And then attending to that, you know, what roles do NGO groups have in building a new system?
Well, I suppose in the context of the physical bricks and mortar of how people in direct provision will be accommodated into the future, the government has to take the lead there. But I think the government needs to, and will, under my approach, will take advantage of the very large amount of goodwill that is out there in communities where direct provision is currently established, and will look to harness that into the future. And as I mentioned, some direct provision centres have these friends of direct provision groups established, and I'd like to see them established around all direct provision centres while we're phasing them out, and around all the new model of accommodation once we introduce that. And that is bringing together community groups, but also NGOs, and NGO groups supply a lot of social services to those living in direct provision, again, because the state hasn't really stepped up over the last 20 years. And as regards NGO groups generally, there have been a significant number of NGOs who've been very involved in this sector, some Irish-based, but there's one in particular, MASI, the Movement of Asylum Seekers in Ireland, and that organisation is comprised only of people who are either in direct provision or have come through that system. And MASI, I suppose, is a very authentic reflection of the voices of the people who are actually experiencing the difficult circumstances of direct provision. And I think that's important, because it gives people in direct provision greater agency in the context of how we change it. There's been a significant piece of work done by an expert group over the last number of months, and that report will be brought to the Cabinet, the government in Ireland, in the next number of weeks, and that will feed into the new system that we're hoping to create. And MASI were represented on that expert group, and I think that was really important. But the NGOs, the Irish NGOs that have been established over the years, certainly I'll be engaging very I have in my previous role, and I will continue as Minister to engage very substantively with them. I spoke about the homelessness crisis earlier in Ireland, and NGOs, particularly those designed around providing housing options for people are well established in Ireland. And I'll be looking and hopefully trying to tap into some of that expertise as regards how we provide housing for people in direct provision.
Thank you. And returning to the question of integration more broadly, native networks as such are incredibly important and prove very beneficial. So that's connections with Irish-born people, and the places where these connections are made, or in the workplace, or in various sports or that kind of thing. What areas of Irish society do you think are helping to create these networks, and can more be done to help create such networks?
I would say sporting organizations do a huge amount, particularly football, soccer. Organizations do a very significant amount, because I think kids from all over the world follow soccer and get involved in their local soccer club, and that allows children from a migrant background and Irish children to get to know each other, and then hopefully allows their parents to get to know each other as well. And as most of you coming from some level of Irish family or Irish backgrounds, we have GAA in this country, kind of Irish, Ireland's own version of football, and linked and hurling as well. And in my area, I've seen that we don't see migrants joining the GAA in the same level that we're seeing them maybe join soccer clubs. But I know the GAA, as a very substantial national organisation, is doing a lot to try and increase diversity, and obviously, just from a practical point of view, tap into a whole new pool of really good players as well. And earlier this year, I attended an event in Croke Park where the GAA had allowed the use of Croke Park as our national stadium for GAA, a huge stadium, again in the north inner city. And they'd allowed that be used by a Muslim group to allow them have a large scale outdoor celebration at the end of Ramadan. And again, it was outdoor, obviously, to allow for social distancing. So the GAA, and as a sporting organisation, is stepping up and looking to do more in the context of integration. So I think sporting organisations are really, really important in the context of existing networks that can do a lot to enhance and improve integration and solidify communities.
We have a question here from one of our audience members relating to the travelling community in Ireland. As an Irish born and raised person, Ireland, even to this day, is not very friendly to our own travelling community. About 6 weeks ago, a traveller died who was living in a housing estate for the elderly, and only one person from the neighbourhood went to his funeral. Until we deal with our own bigotry, how can we be hospitable to other nationalities? I've also noticed and been shocked at the attitude of anti-migrant and anti-immigrant sentiment.
No, I think that's a very fair point. And as Minister for Equality, I'm also in charge of the Traveller and Roma Integration Strategy, which is the national strategy to break down and end those prejudices against the traveller community in Ireland and the wider Roma community across Europe. And we do not have a good track record in our treatment of the travelling community. And I know efforts have been made to change that. It's in 2017, we recognised traveller ethnicity for the first time, which was an important step. But certainly with the traveller groups that I would have engaged in, even locally in my own area, the fanfare around that particular announcement has not really seen significant changes in the treatment of the traveller population in the country. And we see incredibly high unemployment, I think about 80% within the travelling community. We see very high levels of suicide, particularly among young traveller men. And we see very significant health issues and a lower life expectancy than the population in general. So again, that's an area where I think too many Irish people have kind of made a decision about their view on travellers, a decision informed by prejudice rather than any sort of real personal experience, and have kind of, because they've never met someone from the travelling community, they haven't had an opportunity maybe to change their minds in any extent. But look, the existing discrimination against travellers is definitely part of that wider element of racism that I feel we have to tackle in the country, and we will tackle in the context of the anti-racism plan.
Thank you. Another question here, just on the question of churches or parishes. How do they play a significant role in welcoming immigrants in Ireland?
Well, I'm not a religious person, so I can't speak from huge experience, direct experience. But what I will say is that, again, some of the cross care, which is the Catholic social care agency in the country, is very engaged in supporting migrant communities, and very much looks at the needs within its own particular diocese. So in some areas it's English language support, in some areas maybe it's providing childcare, so people from migrant backgrounds can go out and pursue work. In other areas it's food banks, unfortunately, where migrant communities might be experiencing high levels of poverty. So cross care as an agency, and again coming from that kind of social care background within the Catholic Church, is extremely active across the country. And I do know there are examples of dioceses and parishes that would be very active in the context of supporting the integration within their area. Obviously, with the growth of a significant African community now in Ireland, there would be a significant number of maybe new churches from Protestant or Pentecostal or Baptist backgrounds, and those churches, I suppose, provide a lot of support for their own community. But I would, I know an estate, I suppose, how would I describe it? A suburb at the very end of Dublin, edge of Dublin, called Tyrrellstown in my own area, which is incredibly diverse and would have a large African community, and was having some fairly significant issues of, I suppose, antisocial behaviour, but quite severe antisocial behaviour. And there was cleavages happening between, I suppose, Irish people living there, Eastern European people living there, and Africans living there, and a combination of state agencies, the Gardaí, our police, a combination of kind of NGO groups like local youth groups, and in that situation the local Presbyterian church that had been formed because a very significant number of the people living in the area who'd moved to the area from Africa were coming from a Presbyterian background, and they'd established a strong church together that worked with the state agencies to address many of the significant issues that suburb was facing. And there are still problems there, but certainly the level of antisocial behaviour that had grown up maybe 3 years ago has dropped very significantly. And there you see the state, the voluntary sector, but also a part of a church-based, a faith-based organisation coming together in a successful way.
And I suppose historically, you know, as you mentioned, you alluded to earlier, institutions that were largely run by the church, you know, they failed to support marginalised groups in the past, as we have seen with the various scandals, and now we're looking at direct provision and seeing how the state itself has failed, and you know, looking to a new way forward if it's, you know, a combination of all of those elements and a more literally community oriented kind of approach. On that question of direct provision, we have a question from the audience, and you had mentioned in your own remarks that you're looking for an own door approach to direct well, an alternative to direct provision and a non-for-profit approach. The question coming from the audience member is if you could provide some more details about what is being considered as an alternative.
Okay, well, I'm a little bit limited in that context, in that we're discussing these issues within the government at the moment, and I don't want to preempt the decision of the government. It's a very big decision because, as I say, we have 7,700 people living in direct provision at the moment in situations which vary very significantly. So as I say, some are living in mobile homes, some are living in old institutions that have been converted or not converted very well. Some people are living in their own apartments in reasonably good conditions. So there's a spectrum in direct provision at the moment. But I think what we really want to move away from is the context of strangers sharing living space, and particularly strangers sharing sleeping space. We really need to end that. We need to end a situation where people are kind of given meal times where they must appear, where they will be given food presented to them on the plate in a take it or leave it kind of situation. So having self-catering, so people can actually buy their own food, cook their own food, the food that they like, the food that they feel is good for their children, rather than kind of being dependent on a canteen. And I think those are the movements. So that's what we mean by own door, that someone has their own space that will be private to them, where they can cook, where they can relax, where they can get away from, I suppose, the rest of the world. And when I say not-for-profit, at the moment, the state basically franchises out the accommodation of people in direct provision to the private sector. And over the last 20 years, the state has paid €1 billion for that. And by that, we've been delivered a service that everyone agrees is suboptimal at best, and in times has been deeply degrading of the dignity of the people who are living in direct provision. So the state is paying this money and sees nothing for it. So I think it has to be state provided rather than being franchised out to the private sector. And look, there are various models and the various options, and I think the end model will be a combination of a number of options. But look, that's an ongoing piece of work. But what I will say is, by the end of this year, we'll have published what we call a white paper in Ireland, which will be an all-of-government approach to the accommodation of people while they're waiting for a judgment on their asylum application, but also a range of other issues as well. How do we actually get the asylum application processed more quickly? That's been a major problem, the fact that you've had people living in direct provision for 7 years because it took that long for the authorities here to make an adjudication, yes or no, on their asylum application.
We have a few we're nearing the end of our question time, I'm afraid, but we have a few kind of questions about the European context. And one person was asking about, the EU enlargement in the mid 2000s, and how did that go really in Ireland? How did that wave of migration settle? And as a kind of follow-up question, you'd mentioned Euroscepticism in your talk. Why do you think it hasn't really taken hold in Ireland to the same extent as in England?
As regards the migration from Eastern Europe, I'll speak, I suppose, from my own experience maybe, and this mightn't be reflective everywhere, but my area, so I've been running in a lot of elections over the years since I first ran for election in 2004, which was the first time, which was the year that the succession happened. And what I was noticing between that election, where there weren't many Eastern Europeans in my area, to the following election, just the difference in streets, the number of people who were answering the door with a, you know, a Polish or a Lithuanian or a Romanian accent. It was a huge difference in my area as a kind of a suburb on the outer edges of Dublin City, where rent prices would have been reasonable, and a lot of people had come over, a lot of them maybe working in the building trade or other trades, and they could afford to live. And we saw a dramatic change in the shape of communities in my area over a kind of a 3 or 4 year period. And during the major recession then, in 2010, I suppose from 2008 on, a very substantial number of those people left. And I think some went back to their own original countries, and some maybe moved to parts of Ireland where it was cheaper, because they suffered badly in that recession as well. But not everybody did. And I think it was a difference of if families had put down roots in those initial 4 or 5 years, if their kids had started attending school here, if they felt they were integrated. So there was a definite, in my area, definite decrease in the number of people from Eastern and Central Europe, but there remains a community, a very substantial community in my area. And we see that now in the context of children who moved from primary school into secondary school. And even I ended up teaching kids when I was in DCU over the last number of years who were from my area, who basically were originally from Poland or Lithuania or Croatia, but are growing up now and see themselves of Ireland, are doing Irish law exams, are looking to practice as lawyers within Ireland. So there were different waves of it, but I suppose the Eastern European communities are very established, and I think probably have found it easier to establish because of their ethnicity compared to maybe African communities, because to put it very bluntly, they don't stand out in Ireland as much as the African communities do. And I think that's certainly been an issue in that context. The second part of your question was in respect of, Catherine, you might remind me there.
Just Euroscepticism.
Yes, yeah. Why is that? That's a really good question, one I've never completely got my head around. I think it's because our membership of the EU has almost entirely been a positive experience. And we're now a net contributor to the European Union. And I suppose it'll be interesting to see, does our approach change now that we're putting more in general than we're getting out in payments and supports. But from joining the EU in 1972 up until kind of maybe the last 10 years, we have taken out financially, we've gained massively from the European Union in terms of like direct transfers of money. So people in Germany and France and Italy, taxes they pay are finding their way to Ireland. And that was hugely beneficial. The opening up of markets across the European Union was vital in the creation of the Celtic Tiger, which sparked our economic boom. It's helped in the context of our relationship with the United Kingdom as a former colony, living beside the former colonial power and always having, up until the 70s again, despite being independent, having a very significant relationship of dependence. And our membership of the EU has allowed us to move away from that, both in context of immediate economic dependence, but also our wider place within the world. So it's been an overwhelmingly positive sense, and the narrow nationalism, in the narrow maybe imperial nationalism, that's a phrase I'm just making up there, but that idea that the Front National in France are based on this idea of the greatness of France back in the day, or the idea of the alternative for Deutschland in AfD in Germany, again harking back to something better. We don't have that in Ireland. So whereas there is some element of a narrow nationalism still, it is hard to tie it into any sort of things were much better back in the day narrative for our country. Because, as I say, back in the day, we were either part of the United Kingdom up until the 20s, and from the 20s up until the 70s. It's very hard to argue that Ireland was a great place, because economically it wasn't, internationally it wasn't, socially it wasn't. So that narrative that fuels Euroscepticism in other countries, it's harder to tap into it in Ireland.
Yeah, and if I might refer back to your talk, I think, you know, there's still kind of a reaction against that conservatism of the mid-20th century as well. I'm afraid, Minister, we've reached our time, and I just want to thank you very much for sharing your story and your important work with us today. Your message of empathy and compassion and mutual support is a powerful one, and as you say, Ireland is at the beginning of its immigration journey in many ways, and you're responsible now for leading that next phase of the journey, and which is one of reform. We wish you every success in that endeavour, and we look forward to following your work in the coming years.
Thanks very much, Catherine, and just thanks for the opportunity to speak today. Since I've become Minister, my life has been lived at a very frantic pace. And the opportunity to, I suppose, write this speech today just gave me a little bit of space to kind of think, take a step back for a couple of hours and think about where Ireland is at the moment, what I'm trying to achieve, what this government is trying to achieve. So that itself has been very beneficial to me. And I hope my thoughts today were of interest to all your audience. So really thanks to everyone in Notre Dame for this invitation. It's been a real privilege.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Thanks.